Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Scottish Land and Estates podcast, ScotLand Matters, where we talk all things Scottish rural affairs. Today I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into a chat with SLE's Senior Policy Advisor on Agriculture and Climate Change, alongside our very own legal advisor, Eleanor Kay and Jackie McCreery, and I can't think of anyone better to discuss today's topic with. It won't have escaped anyone's attention that the end of last month was a really busy time in the UK Parliament. Budget fever swept across the streets of Westminster as the first Labour budget in a decade and a half was unveiled by the Chancellor. After catching up with a few MPs, ministers and shadow ministers from all sides of the House in a whistle-stop trip to Westminster last week, it seemed all but the Chancellor and Prime Minister were in the dark as to what the budget had in store for us. But now we know, and Eleanor and Jackie are here to help me unpick what it will all mean for you and the whole of the rural sector. So welcome to you both. Now, before we jump into the nitty-gritty of the absolute mammoth document that is the 2024 autumn budget, I thought I would ask you both a slightly more philosophical question. What kind of message does last week's budget send to, firstly, Scotland, and secondly, Scotland's rural communities? Jackie, do you want to kick off?
Yes, I think that's a good one, Cameron, because I think this budget there was so much anticipation about it. I don't remember in recent times a budget being so hyped up. And I think there was a lot of expectation of what it might deliver for the rural sector. Ultimately, I think there was a feeling of the word betrayal has been used a lot, but I think disappointment, shock a bit, because we kind of expected some of it, but not the thresholds or the levels that they went for. So I think surprise, disappointment. I'm trying to avoid the word betrayal because I don't want to be too, hysterical about it all. I think we need to, we've had a few days now to sit back and consider it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Betrayal was absolutely the word that the sector seemed to use straight out of the traps there across pretty much all media. That was the tagline, and that's what we're still hearing now. Eleanor, what are your thoughts on the impact of the budget? Firstly, really on Scotland as a whole, as well as the rural sector.
I think, betrayal is definitely the word that you sort of kept coming across. And so much of that, I think, stems from this sort of failure to prepare, sort of to really get the messaging out there. We heard lots of stuff in advance of the budget, probably more than we realistically should when you think of sort of parliamentary protocol. Lots of things announced way in advance, clearly to test the waters. But what we had in the sort of months prior from both the general election run and the time in opposition were various assurances that were almost forgotten when you got to this budget, and the failure to communicate that clearly they'd gone back to the drawing board on a number of these things, which were going to have major implications for Scotch whisky, for small businesses, for farmers in general. It felt like they'd missed an opportunity to say, look, we've had a look. Now we're in office, and we're going to have to drop some of these assurances for now, with a full intention of bringing them back once we've got the growth that we aspire to. Whether you can tax yourself into growth is a big philosophical question that many of us were asking as we saw this budget. But what was really clear was there'd been no attempt to talk to the likes of ourselves and the CLA and farming unions to prepare ourselves to make sure that we had messaging to allay some of these fears. And they were big fears and justifiable fears. But it does feel like there wasn't much thought about the forthcoming Scottish election and what this budget would look like when you're looking at a 2026 election, and then right down to the rural impact, that it's not just the inheritance tax changes that we've seen. It's so many other things that will add together to be quite a significant increase in costs to businesses.
Yeah, definitely. I think, alongside that feeling of betrayal, the other feeling that was really prevalent was probably feeling ignored across the sector. It was the fact that their voice really didn't seem to have cut through. And you mentioned the fact that we weren't approached by the Chancellor for a comment on her plans, but we did, of course, submit a budget contribution. But regardless of that, the sector really seems to have found itself on the wrong side of this budget. But where do you think it goes from here, and how can we insulate it from the worst effects of last week's announcements, particularly on inheritance tax you talked about a little bit there, Eleanor?
So we know there is still an element of consultation around the APR and the BPR. So quite what that looks like is we get many assurances of consultation in budgets, and sometimes they feel a little bit like a foregone conclusion. But at least in this regard, I think it's going to be difficult for government to not consult on quite how these things sort of come into play. We know that the expectation is this will be sort of early 2025 that these changes start. So actually, if you've not got stuff in place now, you're already being affected by the APR and BPR changes. So there is still chance to get these things across. I think Treasury will be open to evidence as to the impact of these things. You know, the figures that we've got from Treasury as to what they think the impact will be and how many farms will be impacted is definitely up for debate. It doesn't include the fact that BPR, so business property relief, and agricultural property relief will now be sharing the same sort of threshold of $1 million, which was always something you could have utilised had they kept them separate. So I think when they are forced to look at the data, I have hopes that there will be some sort of sensible either mitigations put into place, but I am ever the optimist. But I think that obviously it's bigger than the inheritance tax stuff. There are major impacts from capital gains tax changes, the changes to minimum wage, national insurance. This wasn't one single issue in the budget, but it's probably the one that was felt the most in terms of a family dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's right, Eleanor. Just coming back on that, I think it was the cumulative impact on farming businesses, because the budget wasn't supposed to impact, the pay slip of your average working person, but it, the impact was to be felt primarily by businesses. But of course, farming businesses, family businesses, kind of have the double whammy of the inheritance tax, the agricultural property relief, and the business property relief. That will affect all family businesses, and then the other changes in terms of employees' pay, national insurance, all that kind of thing. So it almost seemed a double whammy. And then I think the pickup trucks was just a little final nail in the coffin, just to make everyone feel they were being picked on. And I think Eleanor's point about the connection with the Scottish Government election, I think there's a really good point there that, there's a chance now, I think, for the Labour government at Westminster to show that they're listening to the outcry that there has been, and to demonstrate some sort of a willingness to listen to the rural sector, just to kind of reset that slightly. And hopefully that, with, bearing in mind that there is an election in Scotland in 2026 and the impact I think this Westminster budget has had on Scottish politics as well.
Yes, it certainly seems like the starting gun has been fired on the 2026 election. But yeah, coming back to a couple of points you made there, Jackie, clearly that focus on property relief within inheritance tax and employer national insurance has stolen the headlines. But you also raised a few other important points which seem to have received a little bit less attention than we could have expected. Now, one of those is the unring fencing, and my favourite word from the whole budget, the Barnetization of the agricultural budget. And just for people listening, the Barnett formula, I'm sure most people will be familiar with, is what underpins the agreement between all the devolved governments within the United Kingdom and how their funding is calculated. Previously, the budget for agriculture was set in a ring-fenced way away from the Barnett formula. That's no longer going to be the case, and alongside that there will be new tax arrangements, as Jackie, you alluded to, for double cab pickup trucks, and clearly that's going to have an impact on rural businesses too. Do you think more discussion of these announcements is needed, and perhaps the news agenda could move on to discussing all the other issues that is actually going to, as you said, have a cumulative impact on the rural sector?
Yeah, I think Eleanor will be much better versed to speak about the agricultural pot of money and how that's divvied up going forward. But I think there is a general feeling that we do need to. The APR and BPR has caught the headlines because it's quite emotive, because we're talking about when people die. We're talking about families being able to pass on what they've worked for and what they've built up over their lifetimes. But actually, most farmers will now have a period where they need to sit down and plan and look at what they can do. There will be a certain percentage of farming families who will be able to plan ahead and to avoid inheritance tax. Not all, but I think there will be a period now where farming families need to sit down, and they'll be forced to sit down and talk about succession, talk about the future. And that's maybe a good thing. There will be a percentage for whom this is just going to be very serious for the future of their family business. But on a day-to-day basis, it's some of the other changes that will maybe have a bigger impact going forward. And the agricultural funding is a major issue. The other employment taxes, that kind of thing, every business is going to suffer that. Every business is going to have to deal with that. We're no different to anybody else in that respect. But I think on top of that, the agricultural businesses are low profit businesses generally. It was only last year, I think, in Scotland was the first year that the average farming business moved into profit without subsidy. So if you're looking at businesses who are not profitable without government subsidy, then to fundamentally change that support is a massive day-to-day impact on farmers. And I think, Eleanor, maybe you'll have more detail on how that might impact farmers going forward.
Yeah, I think it's why we have to sort of question the impact assessment, assuming there's one being done on these changes, that the figures we're all sort of coming up with as a sector certainly don't tally with what government and even what Treasury have versus what DEFRA have in terms of their data, which makes it really difficult to sort of allay fears that actually probably only a small percentage of farms will get caught up in this. But that's why it's so frustrating that the messaging has been so sort of poor on this, that there wasn't any prior warning given to the sector that we were going to have to prepare, the vast swathe of our members for thinking much more about inheritance tax and what that meant for their business sort of setup. Because many won't get caught out by this and will probably have many years before they need to think about it, which doesn't mean it's not a valid concern, but it means they probably do have more time to understand the sort of will that they have, to understand the ability that they have to pass this on to their next generation, to set up, partnership agreements and all sorts of other legitimate mechanisms that can be used to reduce your inheritance tax liability. But actually, the way it was announced, it meant many farms got really, really panicked about this, and therefore didn't pay attention to the fact that in England, at least, the minimum wage will go up. Their national insurance is going to go up, which is really tight when most businesses don't make a profit. And as Jackie pointed out, the average farm in Scotland has finally reached a point where it is making a profit. Whether it's truly accounting for all the labour involved has always been a big question in agricultural statistics. But we've yet to see exactly how that's passed on for the Agricultural Wages Board in Scotland. It'd be difficult to see it not mirroring it, at least, or getting pretty close. But farming as a whole is also a buyer of many things. They are going to have increased national insurance bills for their workers. I saw a recent piece of data in the sort of press this morning that the likes of Sainsbury's and others are hinting that this national insurance rise to them would be something like 200 million on a company that kind of operates on 4% margins. So I can't see a way that food cost doesn't go up. So the wider impact of this isn't just on farmers' ability to grow food and be confident in the future of their business. It's also on the costs they're going to have to face, and the cost that the profit they will be getting for their product. So, and then you factor in the double cab pickup, which feels like an unnecessary thing to be sort of tweaking. I mean, the inheritance tax assessment alone, even if government figures are right, looks like 500 million in revenue. But we know from looking at Scotch whisky figures for alcohol duty in previous years that when the taxes have gone up, the tax take has gone down. Well, can you assume that tax take will go up as a result of this? Probably not. And then you look at the other tax that was largely glossed over, which is the carbon border tax, which the only agricultural product within the carbon border tax that's proposed is on fertiliser. Now, a cynic could point to the fact that if you're looking for regenerative farming practices and the reduction of things like fertiliser use, it's not necessarily a bad thing if fertiliser prices go up. But this messaging isn't being delivered in a coherent way to the sector. So it feels particularly unfair to add all these sort of cumulative challenges that come from the budget, to not have thought about messaging, to not have thought about the mental health burden that this places on a sector that's already pretty sort of highly stressed right now off the back of quite a challenging summer harvest. It just feels like this wasn't assessed properly.
Absolutely. It's almost like there's a perception that the agricultural industry has the broad shoulders to take on all this extra tax burden. But as you both pointed out, that's simply not the case. Farmland is not exactly the highest yielding asset people can invest in, and they're not sat on big piles of cash. And when we're talking about the figures involved with inheritance tax relief, £1 million does seem like a lot of money, but in terms of the ability of getting a return on investment of that asset, it's really hard, and it's hard work, and that work is ultimately what puts food on our shelves. And it seems like there is an injustice in placing that additional burden on the people who are doing that, who are delivering that public good for the whole country. So I completely understand those points, and they're all points that SLE has been pretty proactive in making. That idea of having rural impact assessments for all policy and what the knock-on effect of policies like this would be is something we've pushed really hard, and we've warned the government time and time again about this, about the potential impact of their decisions on our rural communities. And it is our role to provide a voice for Scotland's rural businesses and implement the positive change that we want to see on their behalf. I wanted to ask as well, in the context of the budget, how do you both think we can now implement that change and get the government to reconsider its proposals on inheritance tax, on the unring fencing of the agriculture budget, and on double cab pickups? What are the next steps for us?
I think on inheritance tax, we need to be able to present the evidence. There's lots of anecdotal stories in press and social media at the moment about what that 1 million threshold means. And for the average person, as you say, £1 million is a lot of money. You know, if you have £1 million, you're a millionaire. If you have assets worth £1 million, you're a millionaire. But don't forget, this is the cumulative total of your agricultural property and your business property. And it really, your typical farm, when you count livestock, your machinery, your equipment, your buildings, and then the value of land, that gets to £1 million very, very easily. Now, as you say, the return on that isn't massive, and many farmers don't farm for the profit. That's not to say farming is a great way of life for very many people, and they do it because it's a way of life. They don't do it for the profit. They do it because it's something for generations their family has been doing, and to pass on to the next generation. So I think that's why this has been such a massive hit to farming businesses. So I think we need to try and present the evidence to the Chancellor that threshold was really just inappropriate. It wasn't well thought out. It wasn't consulted upon. The data that's being relied on doesn't reflect the full picture. Yes, by numbers, there are lots of small holdings and lifestyle farmers, I guess you would call them, but those are not the people that are producing the food for the country. So the threshold doesn't help the people who are producing the food for this country. And so that threshold, I think that's where we completely accept that the Treasury need to build up their reserves, that we need to get money in. But as someone said recently, you can't tax your way to growth. That just can't happen. And this is not going to result in investment and growth in rural businesses. So we need to look at that threshold, I think, as one point of
And
focus.
Eleanor mentioned the £500 million annual figure, but using other figures that also uses Labour's own statistics on this, some estimates are in the region of 80 to £100 million, and that's about 0.4% of the entire tax rises proposed by the Labour government in this budget. Not a huge proportion, yet the impact of that seems largely disproportionate. Eleanor, do you have any thoughts on how this sort of impact can be blown out of proportion? Do you think perhaps there is a bit of scaremongering going on here, or do you think that these concerns are really legitimate?
I think it goes as far as calling it scaremongering. I think this probably has sort of shone a light on the sort of the challenges we have had within the sector on things like succession planning. So if we were in a sort of if we had a better habit within the sector of having succession plans and using things like the 7-year rules and various other sort of tax efficient ways of organizing a business, we wouldn't have had this quite this sort of vocal response to it. However, that's what happens when you are quite used to having 100% relief. You don't build those habits. So you also can't, I don't think you can overly criticise the sector for being caught out by this. It's why it would have been so straightforward for government to have sort of given a sort of a bit of a heads up to stakeholders to say, look, we've now we're in office, we've looked at this, we're going to have to use it, whether that is because everyone has to be seen to be taking part in filling this gap in the budget, or whether it's because there is this assumption that the broader shoulders sit within land ownership. I don't quite know, but to have not given a bit of a heads up for us to sort of allay some of these fears immediately meant this was inevitable. This kind of panic was entirely expected. I think I didn't really address it previously, but on the Barnetisation of the agricultural budget, that was quite an unexpected one. So, agricultural budget isn't going to be caught in the Barnett formula exactly, which is why it's quite a confusing one. Instead, the historical allocation of budget is now being used as a baseline from 2025 onwards, and then it will be part of the Barnett formula. So we expect there will be some proper Barnettisation of this number. But the frustrating thing is that using the historical allocation of money as the baseline for future years assumes that the methodology was right. And one of the points we made in the general election was that the lack of transparency as to how budget was allocated throughout the UK for this agricultural budget was quite a mystery. We had a really comprehensive review in 2019 by Lord Bew that raised lots of recommendations about the need for consultation with the sector on the allocation of budget, and that was a thing that we could now do post-Brexit. To sort of address the figure by putting it into the Barnett formula and making it a baseline for future years, yes, it allows us in Scotland to have a multi-annual payment framework, which is what we needed. But again, it goes back to this assuming that the way the money was previously allocated was fair, and most of the sector has big questions about that. So we will be pushing on with asking the government to look at this figure again, because it's not looking at natural capital potential or climate change adaptation or any of the really important things that we need to consider when we're looking at funding land management changes. It's just taking an old figure and using it as a baseline, and that doesn't help the sector deliver on the big ambitions that we have.
And is there perhaps a sense of the ball's now in the Scottish Government's court to deliver on what farmers need from their farming budget and the wider rural budget. Now that it is going to be unring-fenced, there's flexibility for the Scottish Government to top it up and to deliver a multi-annual funding platform to give farmers the clarity they need to farm for the future. Do you think that there's opportunities there as well as potential risks?
Yeah, really big opportunities for Scottish Government to, put its money where its where its comments are, and we've had big commitments to things like tree planting and peat restoration and all sorts of other things that can be really critical to hitting the very ambitious climate change targets that we've got. So yeah, the removal of the ring fence absolutely opens up the opportunity for Scottish Government to deliver on those things. But it comes with the inevitable challenge that there are lots of claims on the Scottish budget. We've seen an 8.4% increase in the block grant. Technically, that does mean there is more money there, and that money could be utilised to top up the Nature Restoration Fund, to address the shortfall in the woodland creation grants, as well as the numerous other things that need to be delivered from land. But there's lots of pressure on Scotland.
Yeah, and I suppose the onus is on us now to make the case for more rural funding, which we would all love to see. Jackie, I wondered, are there other aspects of the budget that people aren't talking about enough that we should be aware of?
Well, I think one thing that we and others had been asking for was for agricultural property relief to be extended to incorporate land that was previously in agriculture but then becomes used for environmental land management or under an environmental land management scheme. And the government have confirmed that that's to be the case. There was a consultation on this, and it seemed to have stalled somewhat, but it got hidden by the negative issues. But that was a positive, because it should encourage and open the door. A lot of people were holding back because they didn't know how the land was to be treated if they moved into environmental land management. So that is a positive in the whole scheme of things.
Well, good to punctuate our conversation on the budget with a positive note. But Eleanor, I've got a bonus question for you. At the time of recording this, we've just seen the result come in from the US that Donald Trump has won the presidency in a pretty historic victory for him. Having advised the US government on agricultural policy before, Eleanor, do you think there's anything that we ought to be looking out for in terms of the rural sector in the second Trump presidency?
A very difficult question. I can't talk much about my advising the US government.
If you told us, you'd have to kill us.
No. I think there are many sort of interesting questions to be answered by the change in change in president. One will of course be one of the big sort of focuses of President Biden's time in office was the sort of re-engagement with sort of climate change stuff. That was a major part of my sort of work. Is that going to continue? The US did become quite a leader in a number of these things at various COPs that they were attending. Is that going to continue? There will be big questions as to the US's trading relationship with China, always quite antagonistic under President Trump. I can't see that going away. He was very critical of what Biden chose to do in sort of perhaps stepping back from some of the sort of tariff wars that President Trump had brought in. So I can see that being sort of a renewed focus. There is many sort of questions around the relationship the USA will now have with what it calls the sort of friendly nations. Trump had in his sort of previous presidency been quite prepared to work with the UK on things. Whether when he finally commits to his position on Ukraine and Russia, that could be quite a transformative thing. From an agricultural perspective, it is where he got quite a lot of votes. And the rural vote does look to have sort of taken on board the messaging from Trump around the increased costs, taxes, working issues. I can see there being things delivered for the sort of farming vote, and probably quite rightly. So yeah, lots of things to watch. I think the fact that we have quite a few months until this change of president, so we could see some sort of quite interesting things. But I mean, there's a farm bill still to get through. I can see there being changes on that front. I'm very interested to see what happens in the US from a natural capital and nature markets perspective, whether this just continues to be pushed forward anyway by the sort of corporate actors of California and San Francisco, who were sort of leading on quite a few of the nature markets anyway. I can't imagine them stepping back just because there's a change at the sort of federal level, but I can see the sort of federal policy perhaps not necessarily making it as easy for them. But yeah, lots of change potentially. That does open up a chance for the UK to be a bit of a leader on some of these things, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, a really fascinating note for us to end on, and that urban-rural divide in voting patterns is more evident than ever, and it's prevalent across the world. So yeah, really fascinating stuff, Eleanor. Thank you very much for that. And Jackie, thanks so much for joining me today. And thank you all for listening. That was another episode of the Scottish Land and Estates podcast, ScotLand Matters. We look forward to joining you next time. Bye-bye.